Because when you ask people about why Rome fell, most people will give you an answer that involves barbarian invasions, right? Barbarian invasions. People say, well, you know, Rome fell because of barbarian invasions. Well, what was that? At the time the Roman Empire was in decline, you had Germanic tribes mainly, Vandals, Ostrogoths, Visigoths, that were pushing back and repelling the Roman Empire. And Rome, even though it was a military society, became less and less capable of actually fighting them. It got to be so dysfunctional that even though Rome was a military society, it was incapable of having its own army. It got to the point that in the final years of the Roman Empire, there were Germanic tribes they hired and paid to fight other Germanic tribes that were opposing them. They were incapable of even getting their own army together. But if you look at the fall of the Roman Empire, and you look at this clash between these barbarian tribes and the Roman Empire, you can see this is a clash of two different civilizations with two different values, right? So your typical Roman was a hedonist. They lived for pleasure, their wild parties, and they also loved all the militarism and plundering and aggression that enabled a small group of people to live that luxurious lifestyle. The god that was worshipped by Romans was, you know, one of the favored gods was Bacchus, ripped off from the Greek Dionysus, right? It was the god of pleasure and celebration. Bacchus was the beloved god of the Romans, but who was the god of these Germanic tribes that were fighting against the Romans? The god was Odin. And Odin is a very, very different god with very, very different values being put forward by these Germanic tribes. So Odin, he's, you know, the god of the Norsemen and of the Germanic tribes. He's got a long white beard, according to the legend. He comes around once a year to restore life to the earth around Yuletide or the winter solstice. And Odin is all about grit and sacrifice and struggle, right? Odin has a heaven called Valhalla, but you can only get into this heaven if you've died in battle. So as the old Norsemen were dying in their beds of sickness, they would take a knife and slice themselves open in the hopes that when they reached the halls of Valhalla, Odin would think that they had died on the battlefield and then would allow them into Valhalla. It was believed that Valhalla was always warm because it was lit by the eternal fire, and that was the source of Odin's strength, this eternal fire. When he came to the earth once a year, it was to restore the life and bring some of that eternal fire and start the process that spring could come again, right? And I feel like as much as very few people in this world are worshiping Odin these days, I understand some of the neo-Nazis out there still worship Odin, right? Some of them. But other than that, no one really believes in Odin. But I feel like Odinism is very well alive today. Right? So every year, they start the war on Christmas, right? Fox News starts telling us that, oh my gosh, there's some school somewhere where they have winter break instead of Christmas break. Or, oh my gosh, there's some public building that is not having, you know, not having a Christmas tree, right? It's a war on Christmas. Oh my God, you know, once a year. And on top of that, what do they repeat during this war on Christmas? They say, oh my gosh, you know, the USA is a Christian nation. The USA is a Christian nation. Well, it's funny. It's funny because I think in a lot of ways you could argue that the USA is a rather Odinist nation, right? I mean, we know that US culture is deeply influenced by Germans, right, and Germanic stuff, right? What's the most popular American food? Stereotypical. You got hamburgers, that's from Hamburg, Germany. You got hot dogs. What's a hot dog? It's a Frankfurter, right? The most common last name in the United States is Miller, also Mueller, right? I mean, there's a huge Germanic influence on US society. And I think a lot of the values that people associate with the United States, especially a lot of the things that those of us who believe in socialism oppose, are very Odinist, right? So U.S. society, what is it? It's pull yourself up by your bootstraps, right? Right? Give it some good old-fashioned elbow grease, right? This idea that you can do anything if you just go out and work hard enough, right? And that you shouldn't feel compassion for people that are destitute or without what they need because they just haven't worked hard enough, right? Right, because anyone can do anything if they just go out and work hard enough. And don't pay attention to other people. It's all about individualism. A man's house is his castle, right? That's very Odinist, right? And it's interesting, and a lot of the criticism that gets thrown at socialists and leftists is very Odinist, I would say, right? So they say, well, you know, that America and capitalism is all about the American dream. It's all about people coming from a new land and making great sacrifices and working really hard, and that's capitalism. And what are these socialists? They're a bunch of lazy weaklings who just want everything handed to them, right? They're just a bunch of weak, pathetic people, and they don't understand what America's all about, and they ought to move to some other country, but the American way is working really hard and struggle and grit, right? That's what we hear from the right wing constantly. But think about it. I'd say that it's completely off. because I want everyone in their minds to picture Fidel Castro. Was Fidel Castro a weakling or a snowflake? No. What about Hugo Chavez, right? Picture Hugo Chavez, right? Just a pathetic, weakling, whining snowflake. Does anyone here know what Stalin literally means? Right? And I think if you look over the history of socialism around the world, you can see a lot of that struggle and grit and sacrifice. Talk about the 5-year plans, right? So in 1928, the Soviet Union announced to the world that they were going to have a 5-year economic plan, and they showed it to all kinds of advisors and different people, and the world said this is impossible. No country can ever do this. No country could possibly carry out this 5-year plan. So the Soviet leaders came back and they said, well, what we're going to do is we're going to carry out this 5-year plan in 4 years. And they painted that slogan everywhere, 5-year plan in 4 years. And they did it. One of my favorite writers is Anna Louise Strong, and she's a journalist. She was from Seattle, and she lived in the Soviet Union, and she saw it with her own eyes. A country that was deeply impoverished became a global superpower. They built the world's largest hydroelectric power plant at the time, the Dnieper Dam, right? They built the world's largest steel industry, right? They brought running water and electricity to the entire country. An entire country was basically illuminated. There was all this planning, right? Or you can talk, I mean, it wasn't just the Soviet Union, right? You can talk about what China has done. China used to be the sick man of Asia, one of the poorest countries in the world. Today, China is producing half the steel in the world. They've got the world's largest hydroelectric power plant, the Three Gorges Dam. They have the world's biggest telecommunications manufacturer. They have raised 700 million people out of poverty. Huge, huge achievements have been carried out. But you can go beyond Russia and China, right? Talk to Egyptians, right? What is the pride and joy of Egypt? It's the Aswan Dam, this huge hydroelectrical facility constructed by Abdul Nasser, the Arab socialist leader, in coordination with the Soviet Union. It's just a huge, huge achievement of infrastructure, bringing electricity to Egypt. Or why is the name Fidel Castro known all over the world? Why do people know about Fidel Castro? It's because he took a deeply impoverished island and built it up and developed it and built a healthcare system that is just the wonder, the model that people all over the world aspire to. Has anyone ever heard the phrase gung-ho? Gung-ho? Well, where does that come from? Well, that comes from the fact that during the Second World War, the U.S. military, the U.S. Marine Corps, was so impressed with the military tactics that Mao was using to fight the Japanese invaders, that they actually started adopting some of the tactics. And what does gung-ho mean, right? It means all together, all for one, joint effort, right? So tell me, the first person in space, was his name Joe Bob, Steve Smith, Bill Allen Richard, what was his name? Oh yeah, Yuri Gagarin, right? It was a Russian, right? Socialism doesn't invent anything, Caleb. Really? Well, who are the first people in outer space then? And you don't have to take my word for it, right? Read Time magazine, what Time magazine was saying back in the 1930s. Read what was being said by Albert Einstein, the most well-respected physicist. You can read what was being written in the journals of the young Nelson Mandela. Read what he has to say. At the time that the Soviet Union was developing and emerging, you had the Communist Party of the United States that was a massive organization. And it was telling people, look, we've lost that American dream. We've lost that American spirit, that entrepreneurialism, that motor-mindedness. We've lost it. But if you go to the Soviet Union, they said the Soviet Union is the new America, and communism is 20th century Americanism. That's one of the slogans that they actually used. Socialism is all about grit and struggle and sacrifice, but it's about building up and building up your community, building up your world, but doing it in a way that doesn't come at the expense of somebody else. You know, people say socialists want everyone to be poor. No, I would say it's the opposite. Socialists want everybody to be rich. They just don't want anyone to get rich by exploiting somebody else or by hurting and making somebody else poor. That's the idea. You know, and I want to say that socialism has actually played that role in my own life. You know, I remember when I was 15 years old, there was a day, and I'll remember it, it was very much one of the best days of my life. I didn't know it at the time. But I remember I was 15 years old, and I went to a Marxist bookstore, right? And I was there, and it was so exciting. I lived in this tiny little town in Ohio. I'd never met a Marxist, but I finally got to visit a Marxist bookstore. So I'm at this Marxist bookstore. Remember, one of these old, 1960s baby boomer radicals takes a stack of newspapers, right? He says, all right, we're going to go out and sell the paper. And I thought, oh boy, what? And like, no, we're going to go out and sell the paper. And I'm thinking, like, so you want me to walk up to people I don't know, try to convince them of communist ideas, and convince them so much that they'll pay actual cash money for a communist publication? Is this a joke? Like, no, we're going to do this, right? So I walk out there and I'm just like, oh my goodness, right? Believe it or not, I was rather shy at one point in my life. And, you know, I'm walking out there and it's, all right, go walk up to that guy, try to sell him a paper. Oh my God, no, just go ahead. You know, I'm walking up to, hi, I've got you know, your newspaper here about communism. You want to buy the, you know, but then I did it again. And then I did it again. And I did it again, and I realized that I was pretty good at selling newspapers, right? That communism kind of lit my own internal fire or eternal fire within me, right? And that's very, very beautiful, I feel like. You know, one thing that they'll always tell you, right? It's one of these witticisms we hear is people say, don't be a fanatic, right? Don't be a fanatic. We don't need fanatics, right? We need people that are moderate in all things. Fanaticism is something you should avoid. Well, imagine that right now you had just had a heart attack. And you're being rushed to the hospital, right? So you're in that ambulance, you're on your way to the hospital. Tell me, is anybody in that situation going to say, now be sure that the doctor you take me to is a moderate guy. Now don't give me somebody who's got straight A's in medical school and just no, make sure he's a moderate guy who likes to drink beer and just chill. I mean, we don't want an extreme doctor who's just obsessed with things. We want a chill, moderate guy. Oh no. If you're on the way to the hospital and your life is in danger, you want to be treated by a fanatical doctor, right? Right? And I would say that the crisis that we're in here in the United States requires fanatical solutions.